Okay, first I'd like to start with thanking you folks, thanking the U.S. Global Change Research Program folks for inviting us to speak today. We're glad to do it. And basically we're talking on how does EPA use the National Climate Assessment. And there's a couple ways that we do this. One is to provide a foundation for our EPA climate adaptation plans. The next is to help educate staff and EPA partners on climate and what's needed for climate adaptation. So EPA and other federal agencies and departments were required to, by executive order, to write climate adaptation plans. And maybe some of you worked on some of these, maybe some of you know about them. But we were told that we had to base it on sound science, which is a very important thing. And we also had to start with a climate assessment, which made us realize, well, that's going to take time to do it right. It's also going to take a lot of money. But there's that second national climate assessment out there. How about we use that? And so EPA turned to the National Climate Assessment, and we're able to save a lot of money, save a lot of time, and also, very importantly, use the broad expertise of the folks that worked on the climate assessment, of all the studies, all the data that was gathered into the climate assessment. So this was a good thing as far as EPA was concerned. And the good news is these plans were finally made final and public on October 31st of this year. We have one national plan for all of EPA, 10 regional office plans, and 7 national program plans. A national program is, for example, the Office of Air or Office of Water in our DC office. You can search for these readily online. They're all there. If you do, look for the October 31st version. Otherwise, you might get one of our drafts. And we will be required to update these every 4 years after the next national climate assessments come out. So, the National Climate Assessment helps EPA clarify its priorities, helps us understand what the climate impacts are, how big the impacts are, and where they're going to be. Now, where is very important because it's a big country. There's a lot of regions. And if we want to remind folks on the East Coast, maybe in DC or elsewhere, what the impacts are out here in the West in Region 9, you can see it there over California, Nevada, Arizona, Hawaii, some of the Pacific Islands. It's a lot easier for us to remind folks of what the impacts are out here if we have the National Climate Assessment to turn to for reference. Also, in order to have a good national program, we all need to understand what the impacts are. So it helps me to understand what the impacts will be in the Southeast and the Northeast. So just to briefly go over some of the differences, a lot of you already know about a lot of these. So, for example, in the Northeast, there's going to be lots of very heavy precipitation, an increase in that. You can see in the map on the right and on the left. The Southwest is going to be getting a change in number of consecutive dry days. So these are big differences. For example, differences from the coast to the inland. Here's a nice photo on the left of San Francisco waterfront during a king tide, which of course brings to mind what the sea level might look like after sea level rise. This is right down on the Embarcadero at the foot of Mission Street. And then on the right is the Sierra Nevada. So we expect we'll be losing, of course, our glaciers, our snowpack. This is a serious thing for California water. But this isn't not just the Sierra Nevadas. You know, we're also looking at the other high mountain ranges, Cascades, Rockies. Then, of course, we have the Pacific Islands we're interested in. There's other islands that on the East Coast as well. But you can look at how there's issues, of course, with ocean acidification. There's issues with the warming of the ocean waters, but also we're very interested, being EPA, about drinking water issues. Some of the islands may be subject to drought. Some of the lower elevation islands may have problems with their drinking water, their fresh groundwater supplies when sea level rises, when they have big storms hit. Then salt water will get into their drinking water reserves. And Alaska is not in Region 9, but it's important to see that there's huge impacts up there. When the sea ice melts away, you get coastal villages like this, native coastal villages in Alaska having huge problems with erosion. Their infrastructure is going, their homes are going. It's just massive impacts. So I'm briefly going to go over what's in EPA Region 9's Climate Adaptation Plan, and this is pretty similar as to what sorts of things you might find in the other 9 regions' climate adaptation plans. So basically, these are summaries. We start with the climate assessment that I already mentioned. We look at a summary of impacts on programs, on partners, on key communities, and we have a summary, a listing of planned adaptation actions. So like I said, we look at how is climate going to impact EPA's existing programs? How can we still make sure that we can meet our mission even in the face of climate change? EPA gives out quite a bit of money in grants. We also have some contracts, but grants is a huge thing for us. We want to make sure that grants we give out for, say, wetland restoration or to improve a wastewater treatment plant, that those projects will still be viable under climate change. So we're starting to incorporate climate, figuring out how to incorporate climate into that. We also look at where hazardous waste sites are. Are some of those where sea level rise is going to be an issue for the hazardous waste facilities? We look at water quality for non-point source pollution. Is that going to increase with given severity of storms increasing? Probably. Are wastewater treatment plants going to have problems with sea level rise and flooding? Yeah, probably. And water supply. We also look at small drinking water systems where we're having droughts. Some of those small drinking water systems are going to be under great stress. EPA works quite a bit with our states. We have many delegated environmental programs to states. We work very closely with tribes. Here in Region 9, we have over 140 federally recognized tribes. We also work with local governments and with a lot of utilities. We want to make sure that we can help our partners plan, that they can share information. We want to be able to leverage them incorporating climate change into their work through some of our funding. EPA also has a very strong environmental justice program, and we try to work with our communities with limited resources or limited income. For example, some of our Native American reservations already have very limited water resources. We expect that some of these in the Southwest, their water resources will become even more limited. Some low-income communities are at risk for sea level rise. For example, you can look at the Canal community in Marin County, very close to the bay's water level already. We're also looking at issues that Glenna spoke about with health effects, since EPA looks at public health and the environment. Very concerned about asthma, about air pollution. And then I'm going to touch briefly on 3 things that are in, 3 examples of what's in our climate adaptation plan. For example, water infrastructure. We're very concerned with water efficiency, helping folks audit for leaks. EPA also has a water sense program looking at water demand management. EPA is also very interested in stormwater management, green infrastructure, some folks call it, looking both at using stormwater to rebuild the groundwater supplies, but also controlling the pollution with runoff into the bay, for example, by sinking the stormwater into the groundwater. This is an example of one of the projects underway down south. We also have a coral reef strategy, and we look at impacts on the corals from ocean acidification, from ocean warming, as many of you know. And with that, what we're trying to do is reduce the other stressors to the corals. So land-based pollution, for example, erosion in Hawaii that gets to the corals. Marine debris is also an issue that EPA is involved with many other federal agencies. And another thing, we work with quite a bit with watersheds, with wetlands, and this coupled with funding. One example is we have grant funds for the San Francisco Bay Water Quality Improvement Fund, and climate change is now incorporated as one of the criteria in the competitive selection of these grants. And briefly, what else do we use the National Climate Assessment for? Well, our employees at EPA are very interested in good science, and they're very curious folks, and they like to see good data. They like good maps. So we use this to help our staff understand climate impacts more. And we have online trainings that's done nationally. It's voluntary, it's optional, but it is available to EPA staff online. And we also use these to help support our in-person trainings that we're providing more and more in the office. And a new development, which is very exciting, was requested pretty much by Local Government Advisory Committee. This is a committee that works with EPA. And EPA will be working with advice from the LGAC to develop a climate resilience toolkit for local governments to use. And you can check this out now. There'll be much more development in the future on it, though. So keep checking it out, especially if you work in local government or you want to help your local government understand what's going on better. So in summary, does EPA find this document to be of value? Yeah, you bet. And we use it both for providing a foundation for decision support for the basic work we do, but we also use it for internal education and to help education of our partners. And there's my name, my contact info. You can find me easily on the web. And this is my climate boss at EPA Region 9, John Kemmerer, works down in our LA office. Thanks.